So I'm thrilled to welcome first Ben Marchionna. Ben is the Chief Innovation Ecosystem Officer of the state of Michigan. He is a future-focused leader building collaborative, entrepreneurial-minded teams that tackle the world's toughest challenges. He was announced by Governor Gretchen Whitmer as Michigan's first Chief Innovation Ecosystem Officer. His charter is to lead the supercharging of Michigan's innovation economy, building connective tissue across founders and their startups, and investors, universities, corporations, and the government. Please welcome Ben Marchionna. Next is Lisa Katz. She is founder and president of In the Mix Consulting. Lisa is a dot connector, a network cultivator, and a strategist around all things tied to inclusive job creation. Her consultancy, In the Mix, works with communities and stakeholders that are responding to changing technologies and economies, helping them grow good jobs and connecting people to them. She also sits on the DeSci Accelerator Advisory Board. Please welcome Lisa Katz. Last but not least, we have Gregg Latterman, the executive director of the Zell Lurie Institute and founder of Aware Records. Gregg's entrepreneurial activity has involved discovering and building artists' careers since the earliest stages. He helped establish the careers of, Train, John Mayer, The Fray, Five for Fighting, Matt Carney, and Brandi Carlile. For 25 years, Gregg has been involved in the discovery, development, production, and marketing of products in the consumer space. Please welcome Gregg Latterman.
I took my seat.
All right, friends. Thank you so much for being here. My first question for you is that there's been so much talk about what startups need to succeed, with a list that includes capital and talent and a supportive and diverse community, quality of life, and so much more. I'd wager that a few of these characteristics of an ecosystem might be surprising to the audience, but this is all what is about attracting startups. So what do you think, in that vein, are the unique challenges to attracting startups from outside our region to set up here in Michigan?
I'll go first. Is my mic working? Excellent.
Yeah.
So there's attracting startups to an emerging ecosystem like the state of Michigan is a multi-dimensional challenge to go after. But what really gets me fired up about this problem statement for Michigan is that we've got all of the right ingredients to go about tackling this. I think we're sitting in part of that epicenter within the University of Michigan, having this super high quality talent pool with access to very high quality capital networks out of state, both domestically and internationally from the University of Michigan alumni base. And being able to tap on those things in a smart way, I think can do wonders for growing the ecosystem that we have. We've had a successful startup ecosystem in the state for a while, but it's been more centered in specific pockets. But I think we're really poised to take advantage of a few years, in particular post-COVID, that have started to change things in a really interesting way.
So mine's working good, yay. I was like playing with every button until I finally figured it out. So it's a lot easier to start a company in a community and grow it in that community than it is to attract one from another place. And if that's gonna be part of the strategy, we have to have a lot of things in mind. We have to have a healthy ecosystem where they can thrive. That means access to capital. They want to make sure that they can find talent, and that doesn't always mean technical talent. It often means talent that has leadership in a startup organization. They want to be able to grow and do the things that startups need to do from a business standpoint. So the ecosystem needs to be able to support that for them. They need resources, they need support, they need to understand how to navigate those partnerships. And with that said, relationships really matter. So if we're going to think about attracting, I mean, Ben brings up a great point. Alumni networks are huge. Thinking through, if we're thinking about international companies, we need to think through ties that we have to overseas populations that may have density here already. we need to tout the things that we're really good at. So if we have a successful cluster, clusters matter, right? So thinking through if we're good at clean tech, if we're good at AI, we need to make sure that the world knows about that so that we are a destination, which means we need to tell our story. So there's a lot that goes into that. But I'm going to just say that it's relationships and assets, and we have to really take strong stock of both of those.
And I mean, I think post-COVID, we're in a more attractive world for where we are, in the sense that location always is going to matter. You want to have physical, but now that we're a little bit more used to being in a Zoom world where we're able to connect with others in a not as good of a way as in person, but I definitely think it helps for capital, for mentorship, for all these things. We can now open ourselves up, because while, especially here in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, we've got an incredible ecosystem in Ann Arbor, but if you open it up to all our alumni just from this school, we can now connect to them easier than we could have before, in more authentic ways. At least, again, Zoom's not as good as in person, but it's a lot better than a phone call. I think it actually opens up the United States in the world in a much bigger way, and gives us a better opportunity to connect back with the people that actually care about this place and want to hopefully help us and connect better with our former students, alumni, people that live here, and anyone that's building the company here.
So in addition to a background in innovation, I also have a background in design. And in design, we are always talking about unintended consequences and tensions. So what are the tensions between attracting new companies or new entrepreneurs from out of state here to Michigan and serving the ones that already exist here?
It's a great question. There are tensions. I would say that a lot of the founders that we have here already feel underserved. And so when you start thinking about trying to bring in more companies, you can maybe, perhaps, I'm just speculating, but I could see that as possibly being threatening. Like, why are we trying to bring people here when we don't have all the things that we need to keep the companies that are starting here themselves? A lot of companies start here, they get to a point where they can't grow anymore and they have to look outside. But the tensions aren't just within the startup community. I think we have to look at our whole economic development strategy. In Michigan, we place so much emphasis on attracting big businesses. And when you think about that, like the very substantial incentives that go to large corporations, we don't do that for small businesses. When we look at the Massachusetts Life Science Corridor, which is globally recognized, right? I mean, we know about the relationships between Harvard and MIT and Kendall Square and all the magic that's happened there. Well, the state of Massachusetts invested over $1 billion over 10 years just to get that started. And part of that was supporting corporate relationships with the universities, but it was a whole, you name it, soup to nuts, funds, investment funds, technical assistance, wet lab space, right? All to support that ecosystem. The other thing they did was they offered incentive packages to businesses. There's a University of Michigan company called Murable that left because they got space and they got funding from the state of Massachusetts to go there. So sometimes the tension is even within our own state strategy between our large businesses and our high potential transformative startups.
The tension's real, but you still need to do both. You have to nurture the homegrown startups to both continue driving the narrative and sort of the reality that you need this large talent base, but growing that base of founder-ready talent, and the idea readiness level too. That takes a long time, especially when you're working with early stage startups. That can take 10, 15 years to get to a reasonable exit these days. Especially in hard tech, where Michigan has a particular focus, or in life sciences, where a lot of the innovations that come out of University of Michigan are baked in as well. And so if you're waiting for that homegrown talent to reach a level of having done it once and be able to exit and do that again, that takes a long time. And so you also have to bring in high quality out-of-state startups. The difference is high quality. And so if we only go after low to mid quality out-of-state startups, they're going to come in and more or less dilute the overall quality of the ecosystem here. Whereas if we focus on the startups that we basically go big or go home with, ones that are have connections to deep pockets of capital or deep talent networks or have a good reason to be in Michigan other than just wanting to put production here, and in a post-COVID world where you can separate your production from where your knowledge center lives. To Lisa's point, if we're incentivizing just the production piece, we won't have the knowledge center workers that are really necessary to drive some of the new innovations. And so post-COVID, if we can get smart about getting both of those things and from high quality networks, that will end up having a net positive effect, because whether that business succeeds or fails in the state, chances are there'll be this stickiness factor where those employees that went through that rocket ship growth cycle in a growth stage startup will stick around and continue to found their own companies in the state, again, regardless of success or failure. If it succeeds, it'll have much better chances of succeeding. But even if it doesn't, they'll turn around and do another level. Whereas if you did, if you brought in out-of-state companies that are kind of low to mid-quality, because those founders or teams aren't quite ready for the big leagues, if you will, then they may start new companies that are going to be less likely to succeed over the long run too. And in a state where you're an emerging ecosystem and you have to win some of the hearts and minds of, say, elected officials to continue having state incentives driving some of these big asks, they tend to have relatively short-term focuses. And if you've got long-term roadmaps that you need to build these companies, you're going to have a mismatch. So you've got to bring in high-quality out-of-state companies and nurture the companies that are here to ultimately have success. Tension, absolutely, but that tension, I think, creates an opportunity for conversation where the alternative is we're only doing one thing. So I think even just having the conversation is a healthy thing for our ecosystem, where at least at the state level, those conversations haven't been had in any substantive way for a long time.
I don't know if I can add more to that.
Okay.
Just keep going.
It's interesting that you talk about the 10 to 15 year time frame. There was a study out of the university. We're at a university, so I hope I'm giving the correct citation for this. But I think out of the University of Toronto, that said one of the reasons why the Bay Area is so successful is density, but not just density for density's sake, but because people are starting out in startups in the first part of their career, learning how to do it.
Yep.
And then creating a startup. And so if I'm reading you correctly, like that's sort of the robust ecosystem that we're thinking about when we think about combining those two things.
Yep.
So are we like in the second inning if you compare us to San Francisco?
Sure, that sounds good.
Well,
second to third.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where we look too, right? I mean, these things tend to happen in geographies. And so even as a state, we have some ecosystems that are more mature than others. And so I can speak to the Detroit regional ecosystem, which is kind of like a 60-mile radius around Detroit that includes Ann Arbor. When you combine those two areas, we rank globally. When you separate them, we do not. Like the two regions actually are almost 50-50 in terms of the volume of activity that's going on. Not the city of, but it's like, it's a little bit wonky, but anyhow. And that is, that region ranked as one of the top emerging ecosystems. And that means they're not established. It doesn't mean that we're like hitting it out of the park, but they're actually surprisingly performing quite well and on the cusp of being a global ecosystem. And so I think we really need to think through what is gonna get us there to that like top 40 list where we really are, that comeback story that people want to see when they think about Detroit, our next renaissance. So yeah, I think we're not gonna be Silicon Valley. No ecosystem really can be, but we can be the best version of ourselves that we possibly can be.
You brought up in your previous response corporates and relationship with sort of the incumbent businesses here. Many of us in this room probably know about Michigan's Great Inflection Point, the Richard Florida report that was introduced at the Mackinac Policy Conference last year. That makes a strong case for using Michigan's assets to compete in automotive innovation, including with startups. Other state and prominent entrepreneurial organizations put significant effort into supporting mobility startups. But what's your stance on consolidating and maximizing resources to build a mobility hub?
So when I think it's interesting when you spend time both in an ecosystem and in other ecosystems, it's interesting to see how people frame things. In Michigan, we always talk about mobility, and sometimes people say, well, that's just code for automotive. We need to move on from automotive. Mobility means a lot of things. It's air, land, sea. It's all the technology. It's the logistics. But we still talk about mobility, and the rest of the world talks about the things that go into mobility. So we see it as like a horizontal instead of the verticals that are like AI, that are connectivity, software development, like all those things that make mobility possible. And because we're here, I think we just get so caught up in that we don't talk about the other strengths that we have because we have that competency. So I think that we need to perhaps diversify the way we think about our greatest industrial asset and think through how can we support those adjacent clusters that relate to mobility but aren't strictly mobility. And when we say that, a cluster is all the pieces that make a hub what it is. Like we don't just have the big automotive producers, the OEMs, you have their suppliers, and you have all the things that make that work. So if we have a clean tech hub, it's going to be an adjacent one. It could be batteries, and it could be the new technologies and chemistries within the batteries. Like we need to be able to peel those apart and understand what makes each of those adjacent clusters tick, so we can fill in the gaps. And sometimes it's going to be the lab space. It's going to be the investment. It's going to be the university and the industry partnership that is working with the startup to make things move.
The adjacencies, I think, end up being really important because I think a lot of times in the state, even when you say mobility, most people in the state who have only known automotive think automotive. And we have to get out of that mindset too, because as the automotive industry goes through its own transformation, whether on a short scale or a long scale, it's changing. And I think that if we stick with or try and double down on mobility, meaning automotive strictly, I think that'll be a losing battle as you move to electric cars and they get simpler and more reliable. The whole supply chain around that changes in a really big way. And because that supply chain is so hardware-based, that's why it's a little bit of a difficult battle. And so you have to look for the adjacencies of where can you leverage some of that hardware that exists to go build some new things, but also look outside of just automotive. The air, land, sea is, I think, a really important element too. And that's not to say that automotive is the only sector in Michigan that has potential for a lot of really interesting innovation. I think life sciences has shown and has produced a lot of ROI in the state for many decades. And the data shows that you also don't want to go try and create new clusters that have no tie to the sectors that you have here. That also tends to be a losing battle. So trying to find out what are the things that the state is really good at, from this like automotive core and looking at the complementary things around that outside of automotive, to life sciences, where without a lot of support from the state, life sciences has burgeoned because of the size of the health systems in the state of Michigan and the quality of the research happening at the larger universities in this area. So those are two easy areas to be able to focus on right away.
I just want to add one more thing. We just sat down talking about mobility and cars, and you mentioned a very important word earlier, which was hard tech, right? So the other thing that we need to think about, if we're going to be a state that has all these engineering capacities, all these manufacturing capacities, and we want to support startups, we have to recognize a lot of them are going to be in the hardware space, and traditional tools for startups are often not in the hardware space. So we need to look at the types of capital access that we need, purchase order support, purchase order financing, all those different types of tools that are unique to who we are, and we have tremendous assets in the hardware space.
Yeah. So, sorry. To go back to sort of the cars is not everything idea, there's also that incorrect perception among young people, right? And we know that one of the places Michigan is lagging is attracting young STEM talent to the state, and that really does, put certain stresses on our startups. What can we do to change the perception then, not only here within the state, but with the young talent that we want to come into the state?
I mean, beyond that there's high-paying jobs, hopefully a better lifestyle, and there's places to go to grow versus going to Silicon Valley or to an Austin or other places or New York. Not that they're tapped out, but this is a place that you can actually grow. But to do that, to say that, we actually have to have enough high-paying jobs that whether you're starting a company or working for a company, that there's places to go. And I think right now that's maybe something that we haven't had traditionally here in Michigan. Is like, yes, you can build a company here, but it's harder to like connect, have more connective tissue because there's not as many other companies doing similar things. So again, we have to have more clusters of companies in different verticals that you can actually rely on each other to build something versus just being by yourself.
I think actions speak louder than words too for those that young talent. I think they can hear that states are good for them and why you should move to there. And I think every state probably makes that pitch that is an emerging ecosystem. And so if you go off and make a big bet and you can show companies that have actually done this and the state is behind it and supportive and there's a burgeoning organic ecosystem even outside of just the government element that makes that go, I think that does wonders for telling that story too. And we talked about this at the start, but whether it's the classic Midwest, not wanting to talk about all the good things that you're doing or whatever it is, right? Texas will always claim that they're the best, whether or not they are, and we should have a little bit more of that in Michigan too. And so part of that is just getting out into other hubs and telling that story on bigger stages. And small numbers of us can't do that alone. This is where like tapping into the network effects of, say, the alumni base end up being really important because a lot of them have some tie to the state, whether it's just for your university or perhaps they were born and raised here and then left. Myself included, I left the state after graduating from here and then came back later for startups and then stayed for startups. And so those folks who have left the state and have some, the like heartstring pull back to Michigan are always willing to open doors. I have certainly found in really interesting and big ways out of state, and that leads to great opportunities to go tell that story. And the more times that folks hear it, the better.
So I know Nick is here, Nick Morose, and I think what he's doing is really important. So he actually works with students and connects them to different types of startups and business opportunities so they can see, touch, and feel what is happening here in our ecosystem. And I think that's critical. I think we need to be able to help people not just hear a story or not just see an advertisement. They need to actually experience it for themselves. But I also think I've done a lot of work in the manufacturing space over time, and I think we do need to hold up a mirror to industry, and I do think that they need to listen to young people about what they're looking for in employment and in their jobs. And that's things like the workplace flexibility, the ability to work on not just one project your whole life, but being able to rotate and do different projects. Working in a cool environment that actually really matters to young people. It matters to me, right? Like I want lights and I want, like a foosball table. You gotta get good at something somehow. But we need to help them understand the culture shift that comes with young people coming into the workplace.
Yeah. I want to ask a question, and this topic is actually where the idea for this panel even came from. Lisa, I stalked you on LinkedIn, and you were part of a very long thread, and actually, Ben, you were too, a part of a very long thread about pre-seed capital here in Michigan. How can Michigan become meaningfully competitive in pre-seed investing in ways that will also change perception?
So we need all kinds of capital, right? we need all kinds of tools. So we need seed and pre-seed for sure. Some data analysis that I've seen shows that we're actually kind of average in that space compared to other places. We get lost when we start getting into growth and Series A. So a company can start here, maybe not as many as we want. We certainly don't have enough resources as it is. Being average isn't good enough when you want to be global, right? But we lose companies when they start wanting to grow, and we need to figure out, and I wish Chris Ryzik were sitting here right now because he could give us all the answers, but we need to figure out how can we grow that type of capital. There certainly are strategies where we could say, oh, we wish the state would put more money in, or we wish this or that. But I think we have a lot of wealth in Michigan that's untapped, and we need to figure out how do we tap it. Things like angel tax credits, for example, can help our wealth investors de-risk their investments, and we need to be serious about looking at that in a model that could work in Michigan. We have 26 billionaires in Michigan. I'm sure there are many other states that have way more than that, but a lot of them, their wealth is managed by their wealth investors. So we need to think through, like, are there ways that we can work with the wealth investment community to help them understand the opportunities in capital? In our insurance industry, there are limitations that are way more strict in Michigan than they are in other states on how they can invest their capital in quote unquote risk capital opportunities. And it's like disproportionate. And so I think that there are things that we can look at that go beyond like state budget revenues and actually just dig in and think smarter and better about how we can unlock what we have already.
Yeah, I think step one is actually putting some teeth behind it. In my seat, at least within the state hasn't really invested big in early stage funds in 15, 20 years. Today in the House over in Lansing, there's the $60 million innovation fund is on the House's agenda for a vote, hopefully sometime tonight or before they go out and hunting break in 8 more days. So I was in
We planned
Lansing.
demo day around that, by the way.
Yeah. So I was in Lansing this morning, working with some elected officials to move that along, and that's the step one, and is an extremely positive sign, in my opinion. This $60 million is specifically tagged for early stage, pre-seed, seed startups, and so that's a great step one. Once that gets done, there's a lot more that's needed, but it starts a conversation, it starts to drive a narrative, it starts to build excitement. Within a lot of the elected officials in Lansing, there's a perception, because most of them come from very much not startup backgrounds and don't have or don't even have a background in some tech sector or innovation-driven enterprise or something like this. And so a lot of them come from relatively traditional backgrounds. And so there's a perception that state money into startups are either a losing bet or don't help the average citizen in the state. And so there's a lot of advocacy work that has to happen to walk through the story of how new businesses create all net new jobs, where incentives going into the big companies, the ones that have been here for a while, they will hire a lot and they'll fire a lot and they'll go through cycles, but ultimately it ends up being a rough wash in terms of net new jobs into an economy. Whereas the startups, yes, the power law is what defines most venture-backed startups in terms of ultimate success, but you only need a small number of them to succeed to turn the tide on some of these jobs numbers. So the data show that startups are actually responsible for all net new jobs in an economy. And so telling that story, once you walk through that, it starts to make a lot more sense, but it's a complicated story to tell. And the average elected official, you only have a short amount of time to walk these things through with them. And so there's a lot of advocacy work from the whole stakeholder group in our ecosystem to get that stuff done. But actually putting some teeth behind it is step number one. To Lisa's point, we've got a capital gap problem across multiple phases of that. But with relatively limited, say, state-backed funding, you can at least address a pretty meaningful amount of the early stage startups. The amount that you need at the next phase is the piece that comes after getting some funding into the early stage. So you're kind of building the airplane on its way down, but start with the right parts, with the right pieces that you have now, and then we'll focus on the next piece as we go. And we're laying the foundation for those later stage elements now, knowing that they will still become a thing that we'll have to focus on after we get this first piece of the challenge solved.
We are about at time here, so I want to wrap up by saying, we have investors in the room, we have students in the room, talented students, we have startup founders in the room. We talked about advocacy, we talked about putting teeth in it. How can they get involved? What's your recommendation?
I mean, what you're doing right now is to support and help us build our ecosystem, support our students, help us tell the story of the state of Michigan is a great place to be, to build a company, to grow a company, to find talent at the universities, and build more and just make this a true incubator for talent and companies, and hopefully it can just keep growing.
What Gregg said.
I think that the ability of, say, Michigan alums that leave Ross and want to go do startups, you have the brand name and the high quality access to networks of consequence. Yes, we have a capital gap in the state for the average founder that doesn't have access to those resources. You can easily build in Michigan and be successful tapping that alumni network because of the brand that you carry. And so you shouldn't be worried about the state of our ecosystem here. And we have a very thriving ecosystem for those folks who are able to tap that network. And I think you end up being a really big fish in maybe a medium-sized pond, and that's a lot better than going to some other ecosystems and just being a number.
Thank you. Before you leave, we have a gift for you. Gregg, I'm going to open yours up so we can show it off, if that's okay.
I didn't think I'd get a gift since I'm
You're getting
internal,
a
but
gift.
hey, I'll take it.
So we have a portfolio company that makes patented pickleball paddles. Revel in Sports, if you're watching, we're giving you these. So everybody gets a Revel in Sports pickleball paddle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the panel. We appreciate it. Everybody, please give a round of applause to Ben, Lisa, and Gregg. Thank you.